Honorable Vice-Chancellor, Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Dean of the Faculty of Management, Professor Kondlo, heads of departments, guests, fellow academics, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending this inaugural lecture. I can assure you I won't bore you for more than 30 minutes. I'm happy my wife is here, Mlamli is here, and his wife Pumzile. I can see Neville Kaula, I can see Dr. Faisal Randera, I can see Brian Chaplock. Thank you for your time. Thank you for coming here. I'm acutely aware of the fact that the subject of my lecture, and especially the angle I will be taking in the analysis, may ruffle feathers, especially among those with firm political positions. I tackle in this lecture a very broad issue about presidential leadership and the imperatives of ethical duty. Of course, ladies and gentlemen, let me indicate from the very outset that there is a dialectical disclosure, a gap or hiatus in the relationship between the ethical and the political. Hence, Simon Cressley refers to the problem of ethics and politics. This is largely because politics is an invention. It lacks foundation, given that politics depends on the will or manipulation of the other. Whereas the ethical, on the other hand, is another sphere altogether. It's a sphere which defines and completes our existence as human beings. But the apparent gap between the ethical and the political actually marks the call to ethical duty. It marks the call to reinvent the political for the humanization of the human world. The burden of ethical duty on presidential leadership is therefore founded in this kind of context. The ethical and political leadership are important given the difficult meaning of the times we are living in, and the questions about leadership role in the fate of mankind. Now and then I get convinced that the greatest problem of mankind in our time is the loss of that which makes human beings human. With the diminishing spiritual condition of our modern times and the loss of metaphysical certainties, the world is gradually losing its human dimension. If the world is to change for the better during our lifetime, the change will have to start in human consciousness. In the very humaneness of the modern man, leadership is therefore key to changing the human condition. It is key to the awakening of a new, deeper sense of responsibility towards the other human beings and towards the world at large. What is lacking in South African scholarship post-1994 is research which has a clear and dedicated focus on presidential leadership. The question is why? One could argue that this attests to the way the presidency as an institution of state is perceived in our country. It is sometimes cast in a messianic mode. It is sometimes cast as a discursive gravitational field in our society. In other words, the space covering presidential leadership in South Africa and the national imperative of ethical duty is under-researched. I wish to argue, ladies and gentlemen, from the very outset, that the ethical, especially in its context, transcendent and generalizable human dimension, is a critical aspect of presidential leadership. hence at the heart of the leadership of a president in many leading countries, especially liberal democracies founded on predominantly Western ideational rubrics, is not merely political leadership and governance of the country, but ethical example to the entire nation. There is now little doubt that South Africans are debating presidential leadership. What should it involve? In the light of what we have seen in the past 5 years, is presidential leadership really what it should be? This is especially so given that the thrill of the Mandela period, the pragmatic foresight of the Mbeki era are now past. The controversies around the current president are not insignificant, ladies and gentlemen, and do serve as a backdrop for some of the questions people are raising about leadership in general and about presidential leadership in particular. Existing scholarship and research on these issues is also not helping much. There is a gap between research on leadership on the one hand and research on ethics on the other. The gap is even wider between research on ethical leadership and research on presidential leadership. The controversies which became part of the presidential period of President Zuma have actually forced scholars to relook this particular area. President Zuma's leadership actually laid bare some important gaps in the study of leadership. Among the important questions is the whole issue about values which should underpin leadership in our society, leadership in our politics, and leadership in our economy. One of the intriguing questions which emerge from the entire spectrum of contradictions, questions, criticisms, which have pervaded the leadership of President Jacob Zuma from 2009 to date, is whether a president as head of state actually has the burden of ethical duty to the nation he leads. If the president is good in his job, does it really matter what he does in his private life? Put in other words, besides being subject to the same laws which apply to everyone, does the president in a democracy like ours have a special duty and obligation to the citizens? A duty which sets him apart as a role model for society? Does the position of president of a country carry with it the burdensome duty of ethical example? Or are the expectations of ethical example an overload on presidential leadership? These questions become plausible given the fact that the president is also a citizen who has constitutional rights to enjoy like any other citizen. What should society say when the exercise of these constitutional rights by the president leads to certain ethical questions and injunctions? For instance, does it matter how many businesses the president's children have? Does it matter which connections they use to acquire businesses? Is it ethical to have the president's private life in the public spectacle? These are the questions that are part of the debate in our society. Perhaps we need to look back and reflect a little bit on the presidential leadership of former presidents Mandela and Mbeki. In terms of ethical example and commitment, or in terms of ethical lapses, are there any issues to single out? And what implications do they have for the study of presidential leadership in South Africa? Ladies and gentlemen, I find a lot of sense in Heinz Marey's analysis. He argues that Nelson Mandela's ability to float above politics, his iconic stature, enabled him to traverse many of the key divides in South Africa. And within his own organization, the ANC. Modern, traditional, black and white, privilege, and deprivation. Mandela was able to traverse all these divides. But the assiduously constructed mythology surrounding him would not be available for his successors, who would have to wield authority in more conventional ways, by building and fortifying a core base and constantly cultivating support among interest groups. Marais then predicts that with Mandela's departure, South Africa would pass from the era of the statesman to one of the politician, from a dependency on the personal charisma of a leader to a reliance on public institutions and a democratized political culture. And with it would come more intrigue, conflict, uncertainty, and possibly instability, says Marais. John Daniels gets to the main point because he talks about Mandela's conceptions of leadership. John Daniels argues that Mandela's conception of leadership as the duty and calling to use the gifts of power and authority in the cause of the greater good of the greater number is what distinguishes Mandela. But despite all these characterizations and descriptions, you find scholars who still raise questions about Mandela's ethical standing. And some of these questions include how a saint-like president, like Nelson Mandela, led a policy with such staggering socio-economic inequality. A country which was at best a white man's country with a black president, in quotes. Was this ethical presidential leadership? All the same, Mandela remains a hero of the international community. And he stands for and he worked for all humanity, all over the world, but not only in South Africa alone. The presidency of Mr. Thabo Mbeki was different, but it commanded national respect, and its dishonor came largely from within the ruling party itself. It was a kind of presidency which was brutally Pan-African, relationally distant, and insightfully penetrating. Mr. Mbeki was very concerned about his job, and he understood his job to be sorting the country's economy and integrating South Africa with the African continent, and also asserting Africa's role in international affairs. He hardly worried about domestic perceptions, but was goals-driven. Fortunately, as a president, he was not implicated in many scandals, but of course, the arms deal was a major scandal of his term. And whether he personally benefited from it is not really known. Of course, he remains a hero of many in the African continent, despite the ethical questions surrounding the broad, rich economic growth which occurred during his term. Looking at former President Mbeki's track record, one could argue that his view of leadership was leadership is delivery, and leadership is thought leadership. Of all the presidents post-1994, Mbeki stands out because of his love for ideas and his preoccupation with a Pan-African project.